What if the most important moment in Caitlin Clark's early career didn't happen on the court, but behind closed doors, in a conversation nobody was supposed to hear? Not a game winner. Not a record-breaking night. Not one of those deep logo threes that sends an entire arena into chaos. Something quieter than that. Something far more dangerous. Because when Larry Bird decides to step in, it's never random. This is a man who built his legacy on silence. No wasted words. No unnecessary attention. No public speeches trying to shape narratives. Bird never needed that. His game spoke louder than anything he could ever say. So when someone like him chooses to pull a player aside, especially someone like Caitlin Clark, you have to assume one thing. Something was wrong. And not the kind of wrong you see on the stat sheet. Because on the surface, everything about Caitlin Clark's arrival looked perfect. Almost too perfect. A generational talent stepping into the league with more attention than any rookie before her. Sold-out arenas. Record-breaking viewership. Fans showing up hours early just to watch warm-ups. Every move, every shot, every possession turning into content, debate, and headlines within seconds. It looked like dominance before it even fully began. But underneath all of that noise, there was a different reality forming. A reality that only someone like Bird would recognize instantly. Because while fans were celebrating highlights, Bird was seeing patterns. While social media was arguing about stats, Bird was watching behavior. The reactions. The frustration. The emotional energy being spent in places that don't show up in the box score, but decide careers anyway. And that's the part nobody talks about. Because when a player becomes the center of attention that fast, the game around them changes. Not just the defense. Not just the strategy. Everything changes. The way opponents approach you. The way officials see you. The way veterans test you. The way every single mistake gets magnified and turned into a narrative. And if you're not ready for that, it doesn't matter how talented you are. You start reacting. You start forcing. You start playing the game everyone else wants you to play instead of controlling your own. That's the trap. And according to people close to the situation, that's exactly what Larry Bird saw coming. Not a weakness in skill. Not a lack of talent. Something much deeper. Something far more dangerous. A young superstar standing at the edge of two very different paths. One where she stays spectacular, and one where she becomes unstoppable. Because there's a difference. One gets attention. The other controls everything. And what Bird allegedly told her in that private moment wasn't about shooting form, footwork, or playmaking. It wasn't about improving her game in the way most people think about improvement. It was about control. Control of emotions. Control of pace. Control of perception. Control of the entire environment around her. Because Bird understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. The higher you rise, the more the game stops being about basketball. It becomes psychological. It becomes strategic. It becomes about who can stay locked in while everything around them is trying to pull them out of it. And if you lose that battle, even for a moment, you don't just lose possessions. You lose control. So when Bird stepped in, he wasn't trying to help Caitlin Clark become better. He was trying to make sure she didn't fall into the same trap that destroys players who arrive too fast, with too much attention, and too many expectations. Because history has already shown what happens when a league puts that kind of weight on one player. Some rise, some break, and some evolve into something the league wasn't ready for. Which is why this story isn't really about hype, or highlights, or even a rookie season. It's about a warning. A message from one of the coldest competitors the game has ever seen, to the most watched young star the game has ever had. A message that, if taken seriously, could change not just how Caitlin Clark plays, but how she controls the entire future of the WNBA. To understand why Larry Bird's message hit Caitlin Clark the way it did, you have to go back long before the cameras, the crowds, and the headlines. Because this isn't just about two basketball players. It's about where they come from. Larry Bird wasn't built in bright arenas or elite training facilities. He came from French Lick, Indiana, a place where basketball wasn't entertainment. It was identity. A small town where the gym mattered more than anything else, and where respect wasn't given through hype. It was earned through repetition, toughness, and silence. His childhood wasn't easy. Financial struggles, family instability, loss at a young age. And through all of that, basketball became more than a game. It became structure. It became escape. It became survival. Bird didn't grow into greatness because people expected it. He forced it into existence. Hours alone. No spotlight. No validation. Just work. Just stubbornness. Just the belief that no one was going to outwork him, no matter what. And decades later, the foundation looks almost identical. Caitlin Clark grew up in Iowa. Different time. Different era. But the same kind of environment. The same long drives. The same quiet gyms. The same mindset drilled in early. If you want something, you go take it. No shortcuts. No waiting for opportunity. You create it. Before the national attention, before the records, before she became the face of an entire league. She was just another player in the Midwest, putting in work when nobody was watching. And that's where the connection becomes deeper than people realize. Because when Bird looks at Clark, he doesn't just see talent. He sees familiarity. He sees the same internal wiring, the same competitive edge, the same refusal to back down, the same ability to take over a game without needing approval from anyone in the building. But he also sees something else. Something he recognizes instantly because he lived it himself. What happens when that mentality meets the professional level? Because growing up in that environment builds confidence. But it also builds emotion. It builds fire. It builds a reaction to disrespect, to physicality, to pressure. And at lower levels, that emotion can fuel you. It can push you, can make you better. But at the highest level, that same emotion can be used against you. And Bird knows that better than anyone. Because when he entered the NBA, he didn't just face defenders trying to stop him. He faced players trying to test him, push him, break him mentally before they ever tried to beat him physically. Every game was personal. Every possession was a challenge. Every opponent wanted to see if the hype was real, or if they could be the one to expose it. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Caitlin Clark walked into. Not just competition, but resistance. Veterans who didn't care about her college records. Defenders who didn't care about her popularity. Opponents who saw her not just as a player, but as a statement. And in that kind of environment, talent alone isn't enough. You need control. You need discipline. You need the ability to stay locked in while everything around you is trying to pull you out of your game. That's the part Bird recognizes immediately. Because he's seen what happens when a player with that kind of spotlight doesn't adjust fast enough. They don't fail because they aren't skilled. They fail because they're fighting the wrong battles. Arguing instead of executing. Reacting instead of dictating. Trying to prove something instead of just showing it. And that's why this connection between Bird and Clark matters so much. It's not mentorship in the traditional sense. It's recognition. One generation looking at another and seeing the exact same starting point, but also seeing the exact same dangers waiting ahead. Because the truth is, players like Bird and Clark don't just play the game. They change it. But changing the game comes with a cost. And if you don't understand that cost early enough, it can take control away from you before you even realize what's happening. To really understand why Larry Bird even cared enough to step in, you have to look at the bigger picture. Because this wasn't just about Caitlin Clark. This was about timing. When Larry Bird entered the NBA in 1979, the league wasn't what people think of today. It wasn't global. It wasn't dominant. It wasn't even fully respected. In fact, it was struggling. Finals games weren't always shown live. Attendance was inconsistent. Casual fans weren't locked in. The league had talent, but it didn't have energy. It didn't have momentum. It didn't have that one force that could pull everything together and make people care again. Then Bird arrived. And almost instantly, everything shifted. Not slowly. Not over years. Immediately. The Boston Celtics went from 29 wins to 61 in his rookie season. Same core roster. Same environment. Different result. That kind of jump doesn't just happen because of skill. It happens because of presence. Because of impact. Because of something that changes how everyone around you performs. And at the same time, something else was happening. The league finally had a story. Bird in Boston. Magic Johnson in Los Angeles. Two completely different personalities. Two completely different styles. One rivalry that gave people a reason to watch again. The NBA didn't just improve. It came alive. Now fast forward decades later, and the situation feels strangely familiar. The WNBA wasn't failing. It had talent. It had history. It had structure. But it didn't fully have the casual audience. The mainstream pull. The kind of attention that turns a league from respected into unavoidable. Then Caitlin Clark arrived. And just like that, everything changed. Attendance didn't just increase. It exploded. Arenas that used to have empty sections were suddenly packed. Teams started moving games to larger venues just to handle the demand. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game before were suddenly buying tickets, tuning in, and arguing about matchups like it was the NBA Finals. Television numbers followed the same pattern. Games featuring Clark weren't just watched. They dominated. They became events. Conversations. Moments that spread far beyond basketball circles. And on the court, the production matched the attention. She wasn't just popular. She was delivering points, assists, records, performances that forced even skeptics to pay attention. A rookie not just surviving, but reshaping expectations in real time. But here's the part most people miss. That kind of impact doesn't just bring praise. It brings pressure. Because when a league starts depending on one player to drive attention, everything around that player changes. Expectations rise. Scrutiny increases. Opponents adjust. The margin for error disappears. You're not just playing games anymore. You're carrying something. And Bird recognized that immediately. Because he had lived it. He knew what it felt like to walk into arenas where people weren't just watching basketball. They were watching you. Waiting to see if you lived up to the hype. Waiting to see if you cracked under pressure. Waiting for that one moment where the narrative could flip. And he also knew something else. The league doesn't protect you from that. It can't. Because the same pressure that builds you can also break you. That's the reality of becoming the center of attention in professional sports. And for Caitlin Clark, it happened faster than almost anyone expected. She didn't get time to ease into the league. She became the league's biggest story almost instantly. Which means the adjustment period wasn't just about basketball. It was about survival. And that's exactly why this moment matters. Because when Bird looked at Clark, he didn't just see a great player. He saw a player stepping into the exact same role he once had. In a league that was once again on the edge of something bigger. And he knew what comes next. Not the highlights. Not the headlines. The resistance. The pressure. The tests that don't show up in stats but decide whether you stay in control or lose it. Because being the reason people watch is one thing. Handling everything that comes with it. That's something else entirely. The moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a WNBA court, the attention didn't just follow her. It turned into a target. And not the kind you see on highlight reels. Not the kind analysts break down on TV. Something more subtle. More constant. More exhausting. Because when you arrive with that level of hype, you don't get welcomed. You get tested. Every possession becomes physical. Every drive becomes a collision. Every screen feels a little harder. Every bump lasts a little longer. Not always enough to get called, but enough to send a message. You're not special here. That's what the league was telling her. And it wasn't just the physical side. It was everything. Defenders picking her up earlier. Crowding her space. Forcing her into uncomfortable spots. Making sure every shot felt contested, every pass felt risky, every decision had consequences. Veterans weren't just trying to beat her. They were trying to see how she would respond. Because that's what happens when a rookie enters with that much attention. You don't just face opponents. You face doubt. And early on you could see it. Not in her talent, but in her reactions. There were games where the frustration showed. Moments where a missed call led to a look at the referee. Possessions where the physicality disrupted her rhythm just enough to take her out of flow. Sequences where she tried to force something spectacular instead of letting the game come to her. Turnovers started to stack. Not because she couldn't handle the game, but because she was trying to win too many battles at once. The defense, the referees, the expectations, the narrative. That's where it gets dangerous. Because once you start reacting to everything around you, you stop controlling what actually matters. And the numbers reflected that stretch. Uncharacteristic turnovers, shooting dips, losses piling up early. A team still trying to find identity while carrying the weight of being the most watched story in the league. And every single moment was amplified. Social media clips, debates, criticism, support. All of it happening in real time, every game, every possession. There was no quiet night. No unnoticed mistake. No chance to just learn without the world reacting to it instantly. And that kind of environment does something to players. Even the great ones. It pulls you into conversations you don't need to be in. It drains energy you can't afford to lose. It makes you feel like you have to respond, instead of just playing. And that's exactly what opponents want. Because once you're thinking about everything else, you're not fully locked into the game. You're split. Half playing, half reacting. And that's the edge they're looking for. That's how they slow you down without ever actually stopping you. And Larry Bird knew that pattern immediately. Because he had seen it before. He had lived it. He understood that what was happening to Caitlin Clark wasn't random. It wasn't just rookie adjustment. It was a deliberate environment. A test designed to see whether she would stay in control, or get pulled into the chaos around her. And for a moment, it looked like the chaos might win. Not because she wasn't good enough, but because she was fighting too many things at the same time. Trying to prove herself. Trying to answer every challenge. Trying to match the intensity of every situation. Instead of doing the one thing that actually matters. Dictating the game on her own terms. That's the difference. And that's the exact moment where everything could have gone one of two ways. She could keep reacting, and slowly lose control. Or she could change something deeper, something internal. Something that doesn't show up in highlights but changes everything about how she plays. That's the moment Bird stepped into. Not to teach her how to play basketball, but to show her how to take the target and turn it into an advantage. When Larry Bird finally sat down with Caitlin Clark, he didn't talk about shooting. He didn't talk about footwork. He didn't talk about mechanics, stats, or anything you'd expect from a basketball conversation. Because to Bird, none of that was the problem. The problem was what was happening around her. And more importantly, how she was responding to it. According to people close to that conversation, Bird's message was simple, but it hit like a shock. Stop reacting. That was it. No long speech. No complicated breakdown. Just a concept that sounds basic, but changes everything if you actually understand it. Because Bird knew something most players don't realize until years into their careers. The moment you react, you lose control. And in Caitlin Clark's case, that's exactly what opponents were trying to create. Every hard foul, every bump, every missed call, every bit of trash talk. It wasn't random. It was a strategy. Not just to slow her down physically, but to pull her mentally out of the game. Because once she reacts, once she looks at the referee, once she shows frustration, once she tries to respond emotionally, she's no longer dictating the pace. She's responding to someone else's game. And that's where Bird stepped in and completely reframed everything. He told her, don't beat them with emotion. Beat them with expectation. In other words, don't give them what they want. Because what they want isn't just a missed shot or a turnover. They want a reaction. They want to see you frustrated, They want to know they've gotten inside your head. And the moment you show it, even for a second, they've already won something. Bird had seen this at the highest level. During his battles against Magic Johnson, the Lakers, and some of the most competitive players in history, he understood that the real game wasn't just played with the ball. It was played in the mind. Magic would smile, keep things light, make the game feel fun even while dominating. Bird was different. He was silent, cold, precise. He didn't waste energy reacting to anything that didn't directly help him win. And that silence became his weapon. Because imagine this. You play perfect defense. You hit him hard. You talk. You try to throw him off. And he says nothing. Then hits the shot anyway. No celebration. No reaction. Just a look. That's pressure. That's control. And that's what Bird wanted Caitlin Clark to understand. That her real power wasn't just in her range, her passing, or her scoring. It was in her ability to stay untouched mentally, no matter what was happening around her. Because once she reaches that point, nothing works against her anymore. Not the physical play. Not the noise. Not the pressure. Nothing. Bird told her to stop wasting energy on things that don't change the outcome of the game. Stop arguing. Stop reacting. Stop trying to prove something in every moment. And instead, let the game speak. Let the scoreboard speak. Let your control over the pace, the flow, and the decisions do the talking. Because when you do that, something shifts. You're no longer just a player responding to situations. You become the player everyone else has to adjust to. And that's the difference between being great and being inevitable. That message didn't just change how Clark played. It changed how she saw everything. Because once you understand that level of control, you don't get pulled into chaos anymore. You create order. And from that moment forward, the game started to look very different. You can talk about mindset all day. You can repeat quotes. You can break down psychology. You can tell stories about what a player should do. But in basketball, none of it matters if it doesn't show up on film. And with Caitlin Clark, it did. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a headline or a viral moment where everyone suddenly said, "This is different." It showed up in something much more dangerous. Control. Before that conversation, Clark's game had flashes of brilliance, but it also had volatility. You could see the pressure in the way possessions unfolded. Holding the ball just a little longer. Waiting for the perfect moment instead of taking the first available advantage. Trying to force highlight plays when the defense was already leaning in that direction. It wasn't a lack of skill. It was a player trying to meet expectations, instead of dictating reality. But after that shift, everything tightened. The first thing you notice is timing. Clark started making decisions earlier. Not faster in a rushed way, but earlier in a controlled way. The moment a defender leaned, the pass was already gone. The instant a help defender stepped off their assignment, the ball was moving. No hesitation. No extra dribble. No wasted motion. And in basketball, that difference is everything. Because defenses aren't built to react to what you do late. They're built to punish hesitation. Once she removed that hesitation, the entire geometry of the game changed. This is what elite players create. What analysts call gravity. The ability to pull defenders toward you without even making a move. And Clark began using that at a completely different level. Not forcing shots over double teams. Not trying to prove she could score through everything. But letting the defense collapse. And then punishing it instantly. That's where players like Aaliyah Boston started to benefit. Because now, instead of crowded lanes and forced attempts, there was space. Clean looks. Better timing. Opportunities that didn't exist before because the ball was arriving exactly when it needed to, not a second too late. And that's where the numbers started to shift. Assist totals rising, but more importantly, the quality of those assists improving. Turnovers dropping, not because she was playing safer, but because she was playing smarter. Shot selection stabilizing, not fewer shots, just better ones. The offense stopped feeling chaotic. It started flowing. And there's a moment that captures this perfectly. Her 19-assist game. On paper, it looks like a record. But on film, it looks like control. There's nothing rushed. Nothing forced. No unnecessary risk. Just read after read after read. Each one coming at the exact right moment. Not the flashiest pass. The right pass. That's the difference. Because before, Clark could create something out of nothing. Now, she was creating something out of everything. And that's a completely different level of impact. You could also see it in what wasn't happening anymore. Less arguing. Less visible frustration. Less emotional reaction to missed calls or physical play. Not because those things disappeared, but because they stopped affecting her. And that's the Bird effect. Not adding something new, but removing what doesn't belong. Removing the noise. Removing the distractions. Removing the energy leaks that quietly destroy consistency. And once those are gone, what's left is pure basketball. Pure control. Pure dominance, without forcing it. Because the most dangerous players aren't the ones who look like they're trying to take over. They're the ones who already have. Quietly. Inevitably. And once Clark started playing that way, the game didn't just open up for her. It started bending around her. What Larry Bird told Caitlin Clark wasn't just about how to play. It was about how to see herself. Because there's a moment in every great player's career where the game changes. Not physically, not statistically, but mentally. The moment you realize you're not just part of the system anymore. You are the system. And according to those close to that conversation, Bird made that point very clear. He told her something most players never hear this early in their career. You're not just a player. You're the engine. Now think about that for a second. A 22-year-old rookie, being told she carries the weight of an entire league's momentum. That's not normal. That's not something most players are prepared for. But Bird understood exactly what he was saying, because he had lived it himself. When Larry Bird entered the NBA, he wasn't just trying to win games. He became the reason people started watching again. The reason arenas filled up. The reason conversations came back. And with that came something else. Resistance. Veterans who didn't like the attention. Players who felt overlooked. Opponents who saw him not just as competition, but as a threat to their place in the league. And Bird didn't ignore that. He embraced it. Because he understood something most players don't. When you raise the level of a league, you're not taking anything away from others. You're increasing the value of everything around you. More attention. More money. More opportunity. But not everyone sees it that way at first. Some see it as competition. Some see it as disruption. Some see it as a problem. And that's exactly what Caitlin Clark stepped into. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another rookie trying to find her place. She was changing the environment the moment she arrived. Ticket demand. TV ratings. Media attention. Everything shifting around her presence. And that kind of impact creates tension. Because not everyone is comfortable with that kind of sudden change. Some embrace it. Some resist it. Some test it. And Bird made sure she understood that clearly. He told her, if people are pushing back against you, it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because you're changing something. And change is uncomfortable. Especially in professional sports, where hierarchy matters. Where respect is earned over time. Where veterans expect the spotlight to stay where it's always been. So when someone new arrives and instantly becomes the center of everything, it disrupts that balance. And the natural reaction is resistance. But Bird didn't tell her to fight that resistance. He told her to rise above it. To stop seeking approval. To stop trying to fit into expectations that were never designed for someone like her. Because players in her position don't follow the system. They redefine it. And that's where the mindset shifts completely. You stop asking, how do I prove myself? And start asking, how do I control this? How do I control the pace? How do I control the energy? How do I control the narrative, without ever saying a word? Because once you understand that, everything becomes simpler. You don't need validation. You don't need approval. You don't need to respond to every challenge thrown your way. You just play. And let everything else adjust to you. That's the level Bird was pointing her toward. Not just greatness. Authority. The kind of presence where the game doesn't just happen around you. It happens because of you. And once that idea takes hold, there's no going back. Because now you're not just playing for wins. You're shaping the future. And that's a completely different responsibility. One that very few players ever truly understand. But the ones who do, they don't just succeed. They take over. And then, everything's stopped. Not the attention. Not the expectations. Not the pressure. Just the one thing that had been holding it all together. The game. Because in 2025, right when everything felt like it was starting to stabilize, Caitlin Clark went down. First the quad. Then the groin. Then another setback. And just like that, the season that was supposed to confirm everything disappeared. No rhythm. No momentum. No chance to build on what she had started. For most players, that's where the story shifts. Frustration sets in. Disconnection follows. The energy fades. Because when your entire identity is built around being on the floor, controlling the game, creating moments, sitting on the bench can feel like losing everything at once. And this is where Larry Bird's message faced its real test. Because it's one thing to stay composed when you're scoring. It's easy to be calm when you're in control. But what happens when you can't play? What happens when everything you built suddenly isn't in your hands anymore? That's where you find out if the mindset is real. And with Caitlin Clark, it was. Because she didn't disappear. She didn't detach. She didn't check out mentally the way most players do when they're sidelined. She became louder. Not with words. With presence. Every game, cameras caught the same thing. Standing. Reacting. Locked in. Celebrating every play like she was still on the floor. Not as a spectator, but as a leader. And that's where the shift becomes undeniable. Because now the control Bird talked about wasn't showing up in stats. It was showing up in influence. The energy on the bench. The communication during timeouts. The way teammates responded. The way the team carried itself, even without her on the court. That's not normal for a player in her position. That's not something you expect from a young star who just lost an entire season. But it fits perfectly with what Bird was trying to build. Because control isn't just about what you do when everything is going right. It's about what happens when everything is taken away, and you still impact the outcome. And the results told the story. Despite injuries stacking up across the roster, despite losing their biggest star, the team kept fighting. They stayed connected. They found ways to win. They pushed into the playoffs. And in those moments, Clark wasn't just part of the team. She was setting the tone. The same way Bird described. The same way he lived. Because leadership at that level doesn't disappear when you're not playing. If anything, it becomes more visible. And there's something else that made this moment even more important. The silence. Not frustration. Not public complaints. Not emotional reactions to everything that had gone wrong. Just focus. Just presence. Just control. Exactly what Bird had been talking about. Because this wasn't the test anyone expected. It wasn't about scoring. It wasn't about dominance. It was about resilience. And how you respond when the game takes something from you instead of giving to you. And in that moment, Caitlin Clark didn't lose control. She proved she had it. Even without the ball. Even without the spotlight of performance. Even without the ability to directly change the game herself. She still found a way to influence everything around her. And that might be the most important part of this entire story. Because if a player can maintain that level of control, even when they're not playing, then what happens when they come back? That's when it gets dangerous. Because now you're not just dealing with talent. You're dealing with understanding. And once those two things come together, Everything changes. At this point, the story stops being about a rookie season. It stops being about highlights, records, or even the injuries. Because what matters now is what all of this created. Because if you step back and look at the full picture, something becomes very clear. Caitlin Clark didn't just go through a normal introduction to professional basketball. She was forced into acceleration, forced into pressure, forced into becoming something much bigger than just a player, before most athletes even understand what that means. And in the middle of that chaos, she was handed something most players never receive this early. Perspective. From Larry Bird. Not about how to score, not about how to pass, but about how to control everything that comes with being the center of the game. And that's where this story becomes dangerous. Because now, this isn't about potential anymore. It's about evolution. Because think about it. You take a player who already changed attendance, viewership, and attention the moment she arrived. A player who already forces defenses to adjust before the game even starts. A player who already proved she can dominate the pace when she's locked in. And now, you remove the distractions. You remove the emotional reactions. You remove the wasted energy. You replace all of that with control, with patience, with understanding. That's not the same player anymore. That's something else. Because the most unstoppable athletes in history weren't just the most talented. They were the most controlled. They didn't chase the game. They let the game come to them. They didn't respond to pressure. They absorbed it and turned it into an advantage. And that's exactly the direction this is heading. Because if Caitlin Clark fully applies what she's been shown, then everything we've seen so far, that's not the peak. That's the beginning. That's the version of her still learning, still adjusting, still figuring out how to manage everything happening around her. But the next version, the one that steps back onto the court fully healthy, fully aware, fully in control, that version doesn't just play the game. She dictates it, possession by possession, decision by decision, without forcing, without reacting, without giving anything away. And that's the part the league isn't ready for. Because it's one thing to deal with a player who's talented. It's one thing to game plan for scoring, passing, or shooting range. But how do you defend someone who doesn't get pulled out of their game anymore? How do you slow down someone who refuses to react? How do you break someone who already understands exactly what you're trying to do? That's when it shifts. From competition to control. And once a player reaches that level, they don't just become great. They become inevitable. So now the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark will be one of the best players in the league. That part already feels decided. The real question is this. What happens when the player who already changed the game learns how to own it? And if you want to keep seeing breakdowns like this, real stories, deeper analysis, and the moments behind the moments, then this is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to the channel right now, because the way this league is changing, you don't want to miss what happens next. Like the video if you felt the shift in this story, and drop a comment with your take. Because the conversation around Caitlin Clark is only getting bigger, and your perspective matters more than ever. This isn't just basketball anymore. This is evolution. And you're watching it happen in real time.